very warm welcome to all of you from the Development Study Group, the student chapter of the Faculty of Economics, South Asian University. DST is a student initiative that regularly organizes talks, panel discussions, and other academic activities with the aim of promoting pluralism in economics. Hello. DST regularly is a student initiative at the Faculty of Economics SAU that regularly organizes talks, panel discussions, and other academic activities with the aim of promoting pluralism in economics, as well as develop a critical approach to issues in development economics. Today, we are extremely elated to have amongst us Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Today, Professor Patnaik will deliver a lecture on imperialism, third world, and unequal development, reflections on the life and works of Professor Samir Amin. Today's event will be chaired by Surbhi Kesar, PhD scholar at Faculty of Economics, SAU. Without any further delay, I would like to request the chair to take things forward from here.
Thanks, Harshita. As I think most of our audience here would know, Samir Amin was a celebrated and eminent Marxist theorist of development, particularly in context of post-World War development, imperialism, and unequal development. He incorporated the critiques of the mode of production debate in the world systems and the dependency theories in order to develop an integrated theory of imperialism and unequal development. He was one of the most prominent and representative figure of this particular school of thought, along with Andre Gunder Frank, Emmanuel Wallstein, Giovanni Arrighi. He was born in Cairo on 13th September 1931 and was one of the leading figures in the monthly review and was a key figure in the formation of the Third World Forum. Sadly, he passed away recently on 12th August 2018. His life and works left a huge mark in the way we understand the post-World War Third World development. So we are privileged to have amongst us the renowned scholar, thinker, and economist, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who has kindly accepted our invite to deliver a talk on the theme of today's event. As you all would know, Professor Patnaik has made important contributions in economic theory and particularly also in advancing the theory of imperialism and the third world development. So we cannot think of a more appropriate scholar than Professor Patnaik to speak about Samir Amin and the relevance of his work in the current context. So Professor Amin, Professor Patnaik, I would like to invite you to please deliver the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, beautiful friends. As you know, Samir Amin, renowned Marxist economist, passed away on August 17th, and he was of Egyptian, he was born in Egypt. His father was a Coptic Egyptian and his mother was French. His mother apparently was descended from ancestors who had Jacobin links, and likewise his father also, really non-conformist doctor. In fact, both his parents were doctors, so he was brought up in a very non-conformist environment. And right from the beginning, he actually had an exposure of the kind that most children in Orthodox kind of families would not have. He mentions in his autobiography that actually once when he was when a small kid, he saw a little child foraging in the dustbin. He asked his father, what's this child doing? And the father said that, we live in a society in which not every child gets enough to eat. At which Samir said that I'm going to change that society. And all his life, he was not really an armchair economist. He actually was somebody who was very deeply and passionately committed to praxis, to the idea of changing the world, right until the very end. In fact, I used to be in correspondence with him, and just even a couple of weeks before his death, he sent me and others a mail wanting that everybody should form a new kind of international for pushing the revolutionary agenda in the world as a whole in the new circumstances. So he was always passionately committed to the idea of changing the world, committed to praxis. And the other aspect of Samir Amin's work, of course, his background is very clear. Surubi has already mentioned it. He studied in Egypt, in Port Said, and then he went to Paris, where he got a doctorate in political economy. That was not his original subject. He was originally actually doing mathematics, but at some point he decided to move to politics and to political economy. Then he came back from Paris with his degree and joined something called the Institute of Economic Management in Cairo. That was the time that in Egypt you had the young army officers coup overthrowing the monarchy, and Nasser had taken over, and of course you had Nasser being interested in ideas like planning, setting up this Institute of Economic Management in which Samir Amin was involved. In France itself, as a student, he had been associated, he had joined the French Communist Party, and when he came back to Egypt, he joined the Egyptian Communist Party. Now, even though Nasser was very close to the Soviet Union, and Nasser also was very deeply kind of involved with ideas of planning for national development, Nasser, as you know, was very repressive towards the Egyptian communists, as he was towards the Muslim Brotherhood, so that he actually had this position where he actually repressed both the left and the right. And as a result, fairly soon it became impossible for people like Samir Amin, and his boss was also a Marxist, to continue any longer in Egypt in that particular institute. At which point Samir Amin actually went to France again, worked for a while in the planning department there, and came back to Mali, which at that point, African liberation was taking place. At that point, he was associated with setting up the planning department in Mali. And there was talk of Ghana, Guinea, and Mali forming a union, in which connection he visited both in Nkrumah as well as Sekou Touré, in Nkrumah of Ghana, Sekou Touré of Guinea, and discussed ideas about having, let's say, a common railway network, having common industries and so on. But of course, eventually that union fell through, nothing much happened. And as you know, subsequently, Nkrumah was overthrown in a coup, and consequently, that whole project is something that came to nothing. So at which point Samir Amin was involved in the United Nations Institute of Development, Economics and Planning, which was set up in Senegal, Dakar, and from there he moved on to the Third World Forum, became the director of the African division of the African branch of the Third World Forum, also in Dakar, Senegal, where he lived together. I mean, he used to be in Paris and Senegal all his life to the end. Now, the other aspect of Samir Amin, other than the fact that he was deeply committed to the idea of Third World liberation, is the fact that imperialism constituted the core of his thinking. He saw imperialism, unlike, let's say, Lenin and Bukharin and others who actually have theories of imperialism that really linked imperialism to monopoly capitalism, that means late capitalism. Samir Amin saw imperialism as a phenomenon associated with capitalism from its very birth. The capitalism itself is inconceivable without imperialism. And that being the case, he actually tried to integrate imperialism into Marx's value theory. And he did so through a theory of unequal exchange, for which, of course, he was justly very famous. He was not the only one to put forward the theory of unequal exchange, because around that time, Argeli Emmanuel had also come up with a theory of unequal exchange. And before that, this theory of unequal exchange could actually be deduced from Kalecki's theory of distribution. If you remember Kalecki's theory of distribution, the argument that Kalecki put forward is that basically if you had what he called a rise in the degree of monopoly, that means, let us say, in the advanced capitalist countries where the manufacturing sector of the world is concentrated, suppose you have a rise in the profit margins, which occurs through an increase in the profit markup. And since the markup is something which he coined the term, or rather Abba Lerner had coined the term, but he took it over, degree of monopoly, as determining the markup. If you have a rise in the markup through a rise in the degree of monopoly, let's say there is concentration that occurs in an industry or in a set of industries, or let us say there is suddenly cartelization that occurs because of which capitalists collude in fixing prices, then if you have a rise in the markup, then this rise in the markup would mean that the share of the capitalist rises in the gross output that is produced, and if it is the case that the share of the workers does not change, or even if it does fall, partly falls, partly it is at the expense of the raw material producers. So if you think of, let's say, a world in which there are raw material producers, workers coming together to produce manufactured goods, which are produced under conditions of monopoly capitalism, a rise in the degree of monopoly which raises the share of the capitalist profits would bring down the share of wages and would also bring down the share of raw material producers. To the extent the share of wages does not come down too much because you have trade unions, you find that the share of the raw material producers would come down. Now if so, then of course if you compare two dates between date 1 and date 2, if there is a rise in the degree of monopoly, then very clearly you can say that there has been a worsening of the terms of trade vis-a-vis the raw material producers. If so, then you can say that compared to date 1, by date 2, the raw material producers, mainly most of whom are located in the third world, the third world primary commodity producers, have become worse off. So against them, as it were, the terms of exchange have shifted. But the point is, so the idea that the third world producers in some sense get squeezed through the exchange process is an idea which was already there in Kalecki's theory of distribution that was put forward in the 30s and so on. But on the other hand, that actually said that the degree to which the third world producers are squeezed today, it can be compared to the degree to which they were squeezed at an earlier date. So that actually made the comparison between two dates. While the theory of unequal exchange talked about unequal exchange compared not to a date, but unequal exchange compared to a norm. The norm of equal exchange. So if we have a norm of equal exchange, in other words, some scenario which we can describe as one of equal exchange, then logically a departure from that scenario in which the third world raw material producers are worse off can actually be described as one of unequal exchange. Now Amin's theory, which differed somewhat from Emmanuel, if time permits I'll discuss a little bit Emmanuel's theory. Amin's theory was the following. Typically when you look at the world economy, then you find that a unit of simple labor which is performed in the third world, in the colonies, semi-colonies, dependencies and so on, is counted as if it has added a smaller amount of value than a unit of simple labor that is performed in the first world. Therefore, you find that the value of the labor that is performed in the third world is less, is counted as less compared to the value of the labor that is performed in the first world. And if so, then of course you find that the product that congeals this labor, the product in which this labor embodied, would actually have a lower value when it is produced in the third world compared to the product that is produced in the first world. And that's why there is unequal exchange. The consequence of unequal exchange is the fact that because a unit of simple labor is counted as, is supposed to be adding less value when it is performed in the third world compared to when the same unit is, or compared to a unit of simple labor in the first, it also follows that the value of the labor power whose use is the performance of this labor is lower in the third world than it is in the first world. Or to put it in very simple terms, for identical simple labor, the wage rate would be much lower in the third world than in the first world. And one consequence of unequal exchange was this lower wage rate, and of course, from this it followed that there is super exploitation of third world labor in this entire process. If you look at the world economy as one kind of system, then within this system, if you looked at the production of value, then you'd find that there's super exploitation of third world labor. Now, this idea is something which was also carried out around the same time. It was put forward, similar ideas were put forward, for instance, by Argyri Emanuel, who worked not in terms of the simple labor values that Amin was working in terms of, but Argyri Emanuel, who talked in terms of prices of production. So is everyone here familiar with notions like prices of production, Srafa prices, and so on? Are you familiar with that? No, because many are not economists, I suppose. Okay, the idea was very simple. In conditions of competitive capitalism, where you have mobility of labor and mobility of capital, you'd have wage rate would tend to get equalized across all the different sectors, profit rate would get equalized across all the different sectors. In that kind of a world, there would be a set of prices which Marx had called prices of production, which he had said is a deviation from labor values. And subsequently, Piero Sraffa, the Cambridge economist, theorized it, and so people call it Sraffa prices. So what you have is a set of equilibrium prices that would prevail with identical wage rates and identical profit rates. I'm assuming that labor is homogeneous across the different industries in any system in which labor is mobile and capital is mobile. People like Emmanuel argued that when you look at the world economy, labor is not mobile. As a result, the wages that happen in the third world, the wages that are paid in the third world, are much less than the wages which are paid in the first world. But third world labor cannot migrate to the first world in order to eliminate this wage difference. It still cannot, even to this day. There are very strict immigration controls. So you find that wage differences do not tend to get equalized. But on the other hand, Emmanuel argued that the rate of profit gets equalized across sectors, and consequently that set of goods which are produced by workers having lower wages commands a lower price of production than it should had wages been equal compared to the other goods. And that's what he called unequal exchange. You can see it's very similar. Fundamentally, he's also talking about the fact that super exploitation, differences in wage rates arise because of the fact that labor is not mobile, and that being the case, you actually have unequal exchange that occurs, and therefore super exploitation and unequal exchange go together. But what is central to this argument is, of course, super exploitation. Suppose for a moment we assume that unequal exchange, let's go back to Amin's work, suppose unequal exchange disappeared. Suppose it is the case that the third world labor is now counted to add the same value as the first world labor. But as long as wages in the third world continue to remain lower, there is super exploitation. But of course, the effect of that super exploitation now is that the profits accrue only to the local capitalists and not to the metropolis. Okay, so the central to Amin's theory was the fact the third world labor is super exploited, and this super exploitation is something that occurs through unequal exchange, and of course this super exploitation is an integral part of imperialism. Now there is, if I have made myself clear until now, there is, if you look at it carefully, there is an implicit assumption behind all this, and let's get into that assumption. What is that assumption? Suppose third world labor is super exploited. Suppose the third world labor is used for producing, let's say, primary commodities, whose value therefore is counted as less compared to, relative to what it would be had it not been super exploited. Okay. So unequal exchange occurs and is associated with super exploitation. But if it is the case that the third world wages are lower, and that this fact makes the third world commodities which are produced relatively cheaper than they should have been, which is why there is unequal exchange, what prevents first world capital from shifting manufacturing itself to the third world? Because after all, the wages there are much cheaper. So why not produce the same goods which are produced in the first world using the same technology which is used in the first world but located now in the third world, in which case you get super profits? Looking at it differently, equalization of wages does not only occur when they're through the mobility of labor. You can have equalization of wages through the mobility of capital as well, because capital can move around and shift huge amounts of industries to locations where wages are low, in which case these wages would rise, locations from which capital is shifting away, the wages would fall, and have a tendency towards equalization of wages. As a result, the Emmanuel kind of proposition that mobility of labor equalizes wages, mobility of capital equalizes the rate of profit, is a proposition, or even the Amin proposition, that you have super exploitation because of the absence of labor mobility. They are in themselves not enough, because all of them are really superimposed on a structure in which there is no mobility of capital to take advantage of the wage difference. If you like, that it is actually reflected in a segmentation of the world economy in which certain activities are located specifically in advanced countries, certain activities are located specifically in the third world countries. The latter constitute primary production, plantation, mines, etc., and the former consist of manufacturing and things like that, and industry. So, unequal exchange then is, to my mind, based upon a phenomenon which consists of, as it were, two kinds of monopolies coexisting. One is a monopoly of activities. That there are certain kinds of activities which are monopolized by the first world and which are not allowed to be shifted to the third world. Given this monopoly, then it ensures that there is super exploitation, and this super exploitation itself, after all, can occur only because of the kind of monopoly. When the workers are not allowed to move, there is monopoly control over migration of workers. So this dual monopoly underlies the theory of unequal exchange. And of course, when you put it all together, then you can see the role of imperialism in first perpetuating a colonial-style international division of labor, and then ensuring that within this colonial-style international division of labor, there is actually a depression of wages of the third world workers relative to first world workers for identical amounts of labor performed, and that this constitutes super exploitation, and that this accrues a surplus value to metropolitan capital. Now one can of course say that to some extent this kind of segmentation is breaking down in the more recent period, the period of globalization. We know that now, for the first time, you have a situation where a whole range of activities are shifting from the advanced countries to countries like China, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, or what have you, because of the fact that wages are lower here. And they are doing so not to meet the local market, but to meet the global market. As a matter of fact, as you know, almost 60% of China's exports are really, manufacturing exports certainly, are really generated by American companies locating plants in China to export to the international market. So you find that in some sense, the kind of scenario that people like Amin were putting forward in the context of which unequal exchange was being projected is something, or was being analyzed, was being located, is something which is now breaking down in the new period of globalization. But while this has meant that the widening of wage differences between first and third world workers no longer occurs. In other words, in the earlier period of segmentation, third world workers continued to have low wages. First world workers not only were not outcompeted by the third world workers, but as labor productivity increased there, wages increased there. So there was a yawning gap as far as, which was growing as far as the wages of first and third world workers were concerned. That growing gap has come to an end. Now what you find is that the American workers are still much better paid than the Chinese workers or the Indian workers or the Indonesian workers for identical kind of work, but their wages are not rising relative to the wages of Indian, Chinese, Indonesian and other kinds of workers. And consequently, super exploitation continues, though the magnitude of wage differences is not increasing anymore. I'll come back to it in a moment. And before that, I just want to say that when Emmanuel's theory came out, when Amin's theory came out, there was naturally a critique of it. Charles Bettelheim, the well-known French socialist economist, put forward a critique of it, and Bettelheim's critique was the following: that look here, you are saying that wages of third world workers are lower than wages of first world workers, identical workers, it's a simple workers. I mean simple labor. But on the other hand, the labor productivity of the first world workers is much greater than the labor productivity of the third world workers. And consequently, you actually find that wages relative to labor productivity of the first world workers are lower compared to wages relative to labor productivity of the third world workers. Then how can you say there's super exploitation? Then how can you say there's unequal exchange? So Bettelheim critiqued the idea, the theory of unequal exchange, and the associated idea of super exploitation on the grounds that relative to the productivity differential, the wage differential actually was less between the first and third world workers. But of course, Bettelheim's argument, however, was actually logically flawed for the following reason: that if you are, say, and we lived in a world, in which until very recently there was, as I said, third world more or less producing, third world worker more or less produce primary commodities, first world workers more or less produce manufactured goods, let us say. Okay, so you could not compare their labor productivities directly. You could not compare their labor productivities in physical terms, because one would be how many bushels of something per person, the other would be how many tons of steel per person. And therefore, any such labor productivity comparison would have to occur in value terms. Okay. So it presupposes the existence of a set of prices. The argument, however, is that into the formation of these prices, unequal exchange has entered. That into the formation of these prices, unequal exchange has entered. In fact, the whole argument that, for instance, Emmanuel put forward or Amin put forward is that because the third world workers are lower paid, the prices of third world goods are less. Now, if the prices of third world goods are less, then naturally the productivity of the workers in value terms of the third world would be less. And consequently, it's a logically flawed argument of Bettelheim and others, where you are actually denying the fact of unequal exchange by making a set of comparisons based on prices which themselves are based upon unequal exchange. Okay, so that was a flawed argument. The fact remains that as long as you concede that the world is segmented, the fact that real wages of the third world workers, identical labor, are lower is something which could manifest itself in lower prices of the set of goods they produce, and therefore there would be unequal exchange. Super exploitation manifests itself through unequal exchange. But as I said, of late the world has been changing, but it has not been changing to a point where unequal exchange has disappeared, but no doubt the yawning kind of gap or the growing gap in the wages between first and third world workers is something which has been more or less stalled. Actually, there are lots of figures on this. You look at, for instance, Stiglitz puts forward this set of figures according to which, if you look at the real wage of a male American worker in 2011, compare it to the real wage average of the male American worker in 1968, then you find that 2011 is marginally lower than 1968. Now what this basically implies is that, at least taking, not that it is steadily falling, that actually if you just make a point-to-point comparison, then you find that the wages of the American workers have not actually increased secularly. On the other hand, similarly, you look at, let's say, India. In India, if you look at the real wage rate I'm talking about, not even the share of wages in value added and so on, the real wage rate, according to the annual survey of industries in India, in 1990-1991, was actually marginally higher than in 2012. So you find that the real wages have more or less remained unchanged, both in the third world and in the first world, but on the other hand, the first world wages are still higher. So desegmentation of the world economy under globalization has given rise to a situation where wage differences are not growing, but on the other hand, wage differences remain. And consequently, super exploitation remains. Now, Amin's argument was that if the third world is going to break out of this, then it is, and obviously super exploitation means poverty, it means kind of a situation where there is kind of distress as far as the workers are concerned, etc. In fact, Amin was completely opposed to the idea of underdevelopment. He called it maldevelopment. Obviously, because, and this is an idea which also, as she was saying, and Andre Gunda-Frank had also put forward. Andre Gunda-Frank had this concept of the development of underdevelopment. That basically, the term underdevelopment suggests that there was a kind of race. Some people went ahead, others who were slower off the start or didn't get started and so on. But on the other hand, the whole idea is that misses the dialectics between those who went ahead and those who remained, because it suggests that these two are unrelated phenomena. Underdevelopment simply suggests that some people just couldn't develop as fast. As a matter of fact, both Amin as well as Frank, their argument was that the so-called underdevelopment of the underdeveloped countries was the counterpart, was the dialectical counterpart of the development of the developed countries. So he called it maldevelopment, but of course the maldevelopment in fact is is associated also with this idea of super exploitation, and therefore his argument was that if you wish to get out of this, then it is important to have a delinking of the third world from this world economy, because only then you can get out of this fact of super exploitation. Amin divided the world economy into six, or identified within the world economy 6 different classes. You have the first world bourgeoisie and the first world workers. You have the third world bourgeoisie and the third world workers. And you have, in addition, within the third world, a whole range of petty producers, peasants and so on, and together with landlords and other kinds of pre-capitalist property classes. So 6 classes he identified within the world economy, and of course he saw the revolutionary, the most important revolutionary class within the third world that could take the lead in delinking the third world economies from the first world was the third world workers, who of course had to have alliances with the third world petty producers, peasants and so on in order to accomplish this task. Now, what is actually remarkable is that this idea of delinking is something which he remained committed to till the end of his life. You know, I think many people did. You see, imperialism, she was talking, imperialism is a concept which not many people accept these days. Imperialism as a concept was really rarely accepted as far as the advanced countries are concerned. Rarely accepted. Frankly, even the advanced countries left, unless you are talking about the traditional left, the communist left and so on, the advanced countries left, new left and so on, really are very, very skeptical about the concept of imperialism. And what is more, even within the third world, many people believe that precisely because in the era of neoliberalism and globalization, you have, as I mentioned earlier, a desegmentation of the world economy, that basically a whole range of activities are now moving towards the underdeveloped countries from the advanced countries, because of which now Donald Trump is putting restrictions upon such movement, because of you know, in this situation, to talk of imperialism no longer makes sense, because their argument would be that imperialism made sense in the colonial period, in which the third world was stuck in primary commodity production and so on. But now, you look at the third world is growing very rapidly with activity shifting from the advanced countries, and therefore you can no longer talk in terms of 2 different segments of the world, one kind of exploiting the other, one ensuring that the other remains only in the zone of primary production. Therefore, many people, even within the third world, oppose the idea of imperialism. Amin, however, as I said, stuck to this belief, and stuck to the belief that actually delinking continues to be the relevant thing on the third world agenda to this day. Because his view was that really when you look at countries outside of the kind of, you know, broadly what you may say, the Atlantic seaboard, the countries which have broken out of the state of poverty and maldevelopment or underdevelopment would be Japan, but Japan was never colonized, and China could be a possibility. He wasn't very, very certain about it, but his argument was that because in China you had profound reforms, very significant reforms in the Maoist period, relating particularly to land relations and so on, and of course relating to education and other things, China is the strongest candidate in the third world to break out of this state of you know, being at the receiving end of imperialism. But of course, China could do so provided there was no military threat to China, and I mean, did believe that the US actually posed a serious military threat to post-Soviet Russia as well as to China. So if China was not militarily overwhelmed, then there was a chance that China might actually break out of this, but otherwise delinking was absolutely essential for him, even in the era of neoliberalism. As a matter of fact, he also believed that the era of neoliberalism had actually come to an end, that neoliberalism had reached a dead end. That today the whole neoliberal project has now run out of steam. It has reached a kind of cul-de-sac. And consequently, this is not to say that capitalism has reached a cul-de-sac, but the neoliberal phase of capitalism has reached a cul-de-sac. And consequently, where we go from here, whether capitalism regroups itself in order to start a new phase in its life, or alternatively whether you're delinking and a movement towards socialism, depends upon the kind of praxis that we engage in. And that's where his commitment to revolutionary praxis became important, that what happens in the future is something that really depends upon what we do, and therefore he was always exhorting everybody to join this work of praxis for a social change, getting out of capitalism, getting out of this world economy associated with super exploitation, so that a new life could begin. He had great hopes out of Bandung, because that was the first time the third world countries got together. But on the other hand, we all know historically how Bandung spirit, or that whole kind of Bandung trajectory, was subverted through imperialist interventions in country after country. Already such interventions had occurred in Guatemala by overthrowing Arbenz, in Iran overthrowing Mossadegh, and so on. So those interventions continued, and in a certain sense the entire third world project got derailed, the Bandung spirit disappeared, and the third world got caught once more into this web of imperialist relations characterized by super exploitation. And according to Amin, now the time had come to once more think in terms of breaking out of this, because neoliberal capitalism had reached a dead end. And this is what he is. He was, as I said, exhorting everybody else to join in. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Before we open the floor to questions, I would like to raise a couple of questions so that we can set the stage for further discussion. So actually following up on a couple of points that you raised, one being the delinking argument of Amin. Given the rise of capitalism in the peripheral countries, the unit of power in these countries would have a tendency to expand into smaller places too. For example, South Asia might be a case in point for that. In that nature of capitals and the rising global aspiration of these small fragments of capital in these various third world countries, would delinking of a third world and a cooperation of the third world is something that we can expect in the current structure. One being that, and second, again, that is something you touched upon, and I would like to push that forward a little. Basically, when there have been some left critiques of the understanding of imperialism, as you said, as has been posited by Amin in terms of the first world versus the third world. But given the vulnerability of the US workforce, the rise of the trade dominance of China, and Indian and other developing countries' capital moving to the third world, and the rise of finance capital, do we need to reconceptualize this idea of imperialism itself? That is not to say that imperialism doesn't exist, but rather given the global geography of power itself has restructured and changed, should we, instead of a nation-state-centric understanding, look at capital as a global entity and see how those capital power relations work out with it? So these are the two questions that I would like to pose and open up the floor for discussion. They're going to be the two rounds of question-answer sessions, and probably 5 questions per round. And we would like to give preference to students to raise the questions, and please keep the question short and limit it to 1 question. In case there are no more questions in the second round, we can come back to you. Thank you.
But before you open it up, can I just answer your two questions? Secondly, since I'd much rather it was open-ended and we can go on as many questions as possible. I don't think we should limit it. All right. Let me begin with the second one. By the way, I have a choice between trying to say what Amin would have said and trying to say what I believe to be the case. Can I just do the latter? Because I may not be fair to Samir Amin's position. But so let me take your second point first. I believe that at the moment, we always used to think in the old days, British imperialism, US imperialism, German imperialism. Lenin actually saw the First World War, and after Lenin, others saw the Second World War as really a result of inter-imperialist rivalry in which different imperialist powers were fighting against one another. If we look at imperialism today, I believe it is not either US imperialism or British imperialism or French imperialism, but in my view is the imperialism of globalized finance capital. In other words, it is not necessarily an imperialism. Now, of course, behind globalized finance capital, all the different advanced country nation states are united in defending it. I mean, suppose tomorrow you decide to nationalize something, then there will be sanctions against you, then there may be military intervention against you. So, not that finance does not need the military might of the state, but it does not necessarily need, in other words, not as if there is one particular finance called German finance, which is backed by one particular nation state as a German state, but rather you have globalized finance, which is going all over the world, which is interested precisely in not having the world divided up into spheres of influence of different countries, and I think which would generally be defended across the globe by a multiplicity of powers, headed no doubt by the United States, but even including other powers. Okay. So in that sense, you are certainly right that it is not the finance, it is not the imperialism of a particular nation state, but it's an imperialism of international finance capital. Then the second point. Okay, now I think when you say international finance capital, that basically implies also that just as finance is globalized, there is also a financial oligarchy that is globalized, of which the different countries' corporate financial oligarchies are really parts. When the Tatas buy up something in Europe, they're a part of a global set. Okay, when Adanis are going to Australia or Indonesia, they are part of a global set. And consequently, I think what is true is that the corporate financial elite in a lot of third world countries, particularly countries like India, Brazil and so on, South Africa, is really integrated into this global system. And consequently, when we are talking about delinking, the delinking of an economy would have to occur on the basis of an alternative state, in which it is not a state dominated by this oligarchy. They wouldn't like to be linked, but it will have to be a state which is, let us say, dominated by or responsive to the requirements of workers and peasants. That Amin also would have said, as I said, in his 6-class characterization. So it's not, what happened in the colonial period, let's say Indian freedom struggle was one which was a multi-class struggle in which you not only have the oppressed classes, but you also have the bourgeoisie as a part of it. Okay. Now, I think what has certainly happened now is that at least the larger echelons, the echelons of the large bourgeoisie have really, now if you like, the schism in the country is between the echelons of the large bourgeoisie and a lot of these classes, and they have now become part of globalized finance. So delinking has to be understood in that sense, no longer in the colonial sense of freedom from colonialism for the country as a whole, but in terms of delinking. Because if imperialism itself is the imperialism of international finance capital, delinking is also delinking from globalized finance capital.
Thank you so much, sir. My name is Akriti. I'm pursuing my PhD from Delhi School of Economics, Department of Sociology, and I am looking at urban informality and labor. So my questions will perhaps have an entry point from there. Sir, when you talk about the unequal exchange theory, the analysis, Sanyal and others have argued that the focus has been more on the distribution and circulation part, and not so much on the production part. So, sir, how would Professor Amin respond to it and your own thinking around it? Also, when you talk about pre-capitalist modes, these people have argued that it is within the capitalist framework that such kind of labor arrangements and structures would unfold. And sir, when you talk about segmentation, again the related aspect of the formal-informal economy and labor structures is also something which new kinds of modes are actually setting up even within the so-called erstwhile formal economies and in the developed world as well. So how do we understand that? And also about the labor productivity. So for example, my work is on the rickshaw pullers and the vendors. So how does one then compare the labor productivity, which is outside the factory setup kind of thing, and then further the corollary would be how would you then build alliances with such petty modes? And I mean, it's also this labor fragmentation kind of points towards that absence of the class consciousness and that kind of an understanding, if one could say. So finally, has this nature of exploitation also changed over time? For example, subcontractualization of different kinds that we're seeing across. So sir, your comments on that?
Yeah, okay, a lot of questions, yeah, all right. Now, your first thing was about unequal exchange as opposed to production. Yes, of course, as I said, the theory of unequal exchange was set within a particular production structure. Global production structure was such that there was specialization in primary production in the third world, specialization in manufacturing production in the first world, where labor productivities were growing much more rapidly. All right, so unequal exchange does not exhaust the totality of our understanding of the world economy. Unequal exchange has to be located within a certain vision of the world economy in which production is taking place. Okay? I mean, just as unequal exchange does not negate the fact that the workers in the US also get exploited through the normal process of exploitation or the generation of surplus value in the production process. That doesn't disappear. So unequal exchange has got to be located within a much broader picture. But the picture which these people had in mind, not always made explicit, is this kind of colonial division. But within that, unequal exchange does make sense. Okay? And the reason for that, which they don't go into, is not, okay, I think absence of labor mobility sustains unequal exchange. But why is it that you actually have to start with such abysmal real wages in the third world countries? You have such abysmal real wages in third world countries because of the fact that colonial deindustrialization generated huge labor reserves here. I say this because some of you are students of economics. I don't know if you have read Arthur Lewis's Evolution of the International Economic Order. It's not read these days. It's a wonderful book. I mean, I disagree with it for reasons I'm going to discuss in a moment, but it's a classic anyway. So Arthur Lewis's argument is that the reason why we are not talking about labor productivity growth over time in the 19th century. The reason why real wages in Britain were higher than the real wages in India is because an average Indian peasant, and he uses peasant to denote, as it were, the archetypal working class person. An average Indian peasant on an acre of land grew an amount which was 1/3 of what an average British peasant grew on an acre of land. Am I making myself clear? So his argument was, therefore, the reservation wage was much higher in Britain than it was in India. And the reason for this, according to him, is the agricultural revolution in Britain. Many of you who would have read any textbook on economic history, you would have the chapter on agricultural revolution preceding the chapter on industrial revolution in Britain. Okay. As a matter of fact, this notion of an agricultural revolution in Britain is a myth. As a matter of fact, what you find is that Lewis's comparison is wrong because his exact figures are that say in Britain, an average peasant would grow 15 to 1800 pounds of wheat on an acre of land, while in India it grew only 700 pounds. But the point is that the growing season in Britain is only 3 months. The growing season in India is 1 whole year, in Vietnam, China, everywhere in the tropics. As a result, the Indian peasant, having grown 700 pounds a week, would then go on to grow something else, would grow cotton or dal or whatever it is. Therefore, if you take the period as a whole, any notion of labor productivity must be for a particular period of time. If you take the notion of a period as a whole, in that case you would find that the average Indian peasant, the average Vietnamese peasant, the average Chinese peasant on an acre of land grew a lot more than the average British peasant did. Therefore, the fact that you have a wage difference emerging in the 19th century itself is not because of an agricultural revolution, but is because of the colonial deindustrialization. Certainly, large numbers of people thrown out of their traditional craft production were actually thrown onto land, which raised land rents and which lowered real wages and so on. So the fact is that we should be clear that while unequal exchange theories don't go into it, but of course lack of mobility of labor sustains unequal exchange, but of course unequal exchange arises in this wage difference because of the fact of colonialism itself. Alright, so then your second question was of pre-capitalist modes. You see, the term pre-capitalist, of course, is something which is missing because agriculture in countries like India is not in that pristine state of pre-capitalism where it was. It is, of course, it is an encroachment of capital into that, and what you have is a pre-capitalist mode that has been molded, shaped by the encroachment of capitalism. But I still call it pre-capitalist because nonetheless it is peasant production. I mean, if you look at the extent of capitalist production in Indian agriculture, it's still relatively small, and let us not forget that almost half our total workforce is still engaged in agriculture, and consequently some other word may be better, but I just use pre-capitalist in that sense. Now, segmentation. You see, no matter, I used the term segmentation only to denote the fact that the pattern of international division of labor, which existed for decades and decades and decades, existed right until decolonization, from which the whole import substituting industrialization strategy, the whole Nehruvian development strategy was an attempt to break away. Now that is something which now under neoliberalism is spontaneously being broken through the inflow of capital from the advanced countries. Okay. The reason why real wages of American workers do not rise is precisely this. If the American workers go on strike tomorrow demanding higher real wages, their employers would say, thank you, we are now going to Vietnam. Okay. As a result, it has weakened trade unions everywhere. Okay. And so the whole ability of the working class, even in the advanced countries, to snatch away labor productivity gains in the form of real wage gains has really subsided greatly. Now, I use the term breaking of the segmentation only in that sense. Not in the sense that the labor market itself has somehow been integrated and so on. In fact, I'd like to put it the other way around. That when you look, okay, now I think one of the things which Amin does not discuss as much, but on the other hand, the fact we can all notice, one of the things which has actually happened under globalization, neoliberal policies and so on, is that everywhere in the world, and certainly we see it in our own case, there is a destruction of petty production, including peasant agriculture, that is taking place. Okay. Now that is quite undeniable. You just look at any petty production sector. Peasant agriculture, we know peasant suicide, we know 15 lakh peasants between 1991 census and 2011 have left agriculture. We know that there is a distress as far as agriculture is concerned. Any calculation would actually tell you that. In fact, I did a very kind of simple back of the envelope calculation. Take 2013-14 as your base year. Take the latest year for which we have got data, that is 2000. It's 3 years. That is 16-17. That is the latest. Or even for the latest year, 17-18, you can make some kind of calculation, making some assumptions. So it doesn't matter what you take as terminal period. Take the nominal terms, any of you can try tonight, take in nominal terms what is the value added in agriculture, divided by the agriculture dependent population. Now we don't know what the agriculture dependent population, how it has changed, but it's reasonable to assume that more or less the rate of growth of overall population will be the same as the rate of growth of agriculture dependent population. Within 3 years, you're unlikely to have enormous shifts as far as the workforce is concerned. Calculate the per capita nominal value added, divide it by a consumer price index for rural areas, which is available from official sources, and you'll find that in real terms, per capita real income, and this income is the goal, of the agriculture dependent population in your terminal year is lower than in 2013, and that's in flow terms. Okay. So it doesn't require great ingenuity to know that there is an assault on petty production that is taking place everywhere. As I mentioned, census data show that 15 lakh peasants are less in 2011 compared to 1991. They come to the urban areas. In the urban areas, there are not enough jobs. As a result, they join what Marx would have called the reserve army of labor. But in India, what you find is that you don't have an active army and the reserve army in the way Marx was talking about. You don't have people who are fully employed and people who are wholly unemployed. Employment rationing in India takes the form of, let's say, large numbers of people being unemployed for bits of time. Okay? Casual employment, intermittent employment, part-time employment, something called petty entrepreneurship, which is actually disguised unemployment. All these are forms in which the reserve army of labor manifests itself. So when I talk about desegmentation, I'm not talking about the fact that somehow the labor market has got integrated. On the contrary, the labor market has proliferated in terms of all kinds of different ways in which employment rationing manifests itself. So my segmentation remarks must be taken that way. Your next question is about alliances. How do you form alliances? Well, exactly a week ago on the 5th, I think there was a huge rally that took place in the capital of workers, peasants, and agricultural laborers. Okay. Now, it's true that bulk of them, at least 1.5 lakhs, I know this is something which is quite remarkable because in recent memory, rallies of that size by classes, not on the basis of particular demands and so on, but really on the basis of class demands had not taken place. So much so that many people had theorized that those days are over. I'm old enough to have seen the huge boat club rallies that used to happen in the 70s and 80s. There are 6 lakhs people who would congregate, 5 lakh people would congregate and so on. But on the other hand, this hasn't happened for a very long time. So the fact that you have still lakhs of people coming in suggests that it's not as if the old politics is fully dead, there's still life in it. But of course it's true that mobilization would have to occur around all kinds of different slogans. I'll give you one example. In India we typically have this thinking that peasantry is only interested in land. No, our peasantry is only interested in prices. Of course they're interested in prices, but they're also interested in healthcare. They're also interested in education. Peasant wants his child to go to a proper school and to go to a proper college. And therefore the demands around which now class alliances have to be mobilized have to be not the demands of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, but actually quite different. As a matter of fact, when you look at peasant indebtedness, which has gone up greatly, one of the main reasons for peasant indebtedness going up is actually healthcare costs. Now suppose I'm a peasant and my father falls in. I can't let him just die. I take him to the nearest hospital. When I take him to the nearest hospital, the government hospitals, as you know, don't kind of exist or don't work or are underfunded. Therefore, I take him to the nearest private hospital. I have to pay through my nose for that, lakhs and lakhs, for which I go and borrow money. I can mortgage my land and so on. And as a result, when the time comes to pay back, I don't have money and I commit suicide. As a result, I was associated for a while with the planning board in Kerala, and we wanted to bring in a debt relief legislation in which peasants' debt actually would just be kind of, and this was before Chidambaram did it, so we didn't have any way of how to do it. One of the issues everybody raised in the assembly when the bill was presented is that, but these are not agricultural debts. These are debts for healthcare. So how can we say that actually these debts are incurred by the peasants for agricultural reasons? No, but as a matter of fact, the peasants' economy is an integrated economy. And as a result, so I think we have to think of class alliances based on slogans which are not exactly repetition of 30s and 40s. Nature of exploitation, subcontracting, yes, I think these are very important issues, but the fact that subcontracting occurs only implies that what Amin would have called super exploitation is actually now even more intensified, because I think the standard real wage movements that, or the average, I quoted to you the real wage rate as revealed by the annual survey of industries. As a matter of fact, the real wage rate paid to Indian subcontracting was very much less than that. Yes, please. I prefer to see when I go home. Actually, now the intention is important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Professor. My question is a little bit interacted to your lecture.
Who's asking?
As here.
Yeah, okay.
As you're in picture, 2008 was the year of financial crisis. And people referred back to Retail Capital at Wall Street. So what do you think how reading of Capital can help people to deal with those economical crises? Or in another word, so what do you think how Marxist ideology can be linked to the current situation? If you can link it to the South Asia, that would be better. Thank you very much.
Okay, that is one. Can I take a few more questions? Yes.
Hello. Sir, I am Deepaman. I am a student of International Relations. I am doing PhD here. So I would rather request you for a clarification on when you describe the nature of global financial capital. You said that today there is no German capital, no French capital. They would rather have these spheres of influence disappear. Well, I do agree that you cannot assign a national character to capital itself. But I would like to stress upon the fact that the capital is especially in the neoliberal global economic system, capital needs the state for its perpetuation, for it to sustain itself. I would like to give you the example. I mean, would Reliance corporations not depend upon India's sphere of influence in places like Bangladesh, etc., for them to have contracts there? Would Alibaba Group not have China's, political influence in Africa to increase their investments there? So, if you would like to clarify that part a little bit, I'd be very happy. Thank you.
I'll take one more question.
So when we talk about delinking, I wanted to ask you more on that topic. When we talk about delinking of economy on the third world, what do we mean by that? Do we mean export substitution, which was practiced by early days of most of the post-colonial societies? Or are we talking about having a structure like Comcon, which we had in Soviet Union? Or we are talking about something like Juche, a complete delinking from the world economy and have a self-reliance? So what do we mean by the delinking?
Okay. The first question was about 2008, and in what sense Marxist theory relevant to this? All right. I mentioned the fact that in the period of globalization, because capital has genuinely become mobile in the sense of locating plants to take advantage of cheap labor and so on, taking the world as a whole, the first world's wages now get tied to third world labor reserves. In other words, if in the third world you have large labor reserves, our wages remain stuck at a subsistence level. If our wages remain stuck at a subsistence level, American workers can't keep getting higher wages because then capital would rather move from there to here. Okay? So in a situation where capital, I'm not just talking about finance, capital in production is globally mobile, real wages everywhere get linked and they suffer from the consequences of the baneful effects of the third world labor reserves, which continue. Okay? No amount of shifting, I should make it clear that no amount of shifting of activities from the first to the third world has used up these labor reserves. On the contrary, what you find is that precisely in this period when there is a lot of growth taking place in most third world countries, as a matter of fact, labor reserves have actually increased, even relatively speaking. People tell me that China is an exception, but I really have reservations on that. In other words, I'm not persuaded that China is an exception. Coastal China, yes, but I don't believe that interior China has anywhere introduced the kind of tightness in labor markets that one would expect, even with the very high Chinese rates of GDP growth. As a matter of fact, you find that when the rates of GDP growth increase, for instance, manufacturing sector, in China, when the rate of manufacturing sector's growth increases, the elasticity of employment with respect to output declines. So it's not as if a doubling of manufacturing sector's growth rate would mean a doubling of manufacturing sector's employment growth rate. On the contrary, you can have a doubling of output growth rate, but the increase in employment growth rate may be trivial, which is what you find. You have, for instance, I think in China, the elasticity of employment with respect to output in the manufacturing sector is 0.8, which means a 12% rate of growth of manufacturing output gives rise to a 1% rate of growth of manufacturing employment. So these labor reserves remain also. If these labor reserves remain, then taking the world as a whole, the vector of real wages does not increase in a period of globalization. On the other hand, the vector of labor productivity is rising remarkably. Therefore, the share of surplus world output increases. That is analogous to a shift from wages to profits. And as you know, a shift from wages to profits gives rise to a tendency to overproduction because at the margin, the propensity to consume out of profits or surplus is lower than the propensity Therefore, there is an ex-ante tendency towards overproduction in the global economy. In the old days, following the Keynesian revolution, we would have said, but it doesn't matter because the state comes in. As a matter of fact, Baran and Sweezy wrote a book called Monopoly Capital, in which the argument exactly was this, that the ex-ante tendency to overproduction in the US economy, because of the increase in the share of surplus, has been checked by the state coming in and enlarging military expenditure. That was their argument. But actually what tends to happen in the period of hegemony of international finance capitalism, finance does not like the state undertaking Keynesian demand management. Finance does not like the state spending to generate employment. Why it does not like is a billion-dollar question. We'll have something to say on that if you like. But even when Keynes himself wrote, I mean, it was just laughed off. In Britain, the city, which is the center of finance capital, did not take Keynes seriously. Roosevelt was the first to introduce through the New Deal state intervention in demand management, but in Britain it came after the war. Nobody introduced Keynesian ideas into British economic policy, even though he was a British economist, a highly influential one was that. Don't forget that he was the head of the British delegation at Bretton Woods. Anyway, so the upshot is that finance does. So in this period, you actually find that the ability of the state to undertake demand management goes down. Everywhere in the world, except the United States, you have fiscal responsibility legislation. And your fiscal deficit cannot exist, they cannot exceed 3% of your GDP. That's true here, and that's true also in Europe, everywhere, European community and so on, Eurozone. So the point is that the standard instrument for demand management, where a rise in the share of surplus and the ex-ante tendency to overproduction generates could be kept in check, is something that doesn't work. Therefore, in neoliberal capitalism, the only counteracting factor towards this ex-ante tendency to overproduction is the formation of asset price bubbles. Okay. You find the dot-com bubble of the 1990s, you find the housing bubble of the earlier this century, and what happens is that suddenly there is an increase in the property prices, you have asset price bubbles, and when asset price bubbles occur, through a wealth effect, people start consuming more because you feel you're very rich. And what is more, if it is financial assets, if the bubble affects financial assets, that basically means the cost of borrowing goes down, and therefore you can borrow a bit more, investment goes up. So the real economy gets stimulated by this bubble, which is a pure bubble, and that's exactly what happened. But when the bubble bursts, you actually have a crisis in the real economy. Now this happened in 2008. The housing bubble burst in 2008. There has been no significant bubble after that. You cannot generate a bubble by holding a gun to people's heads saying, start kind of buying assets. The US brought down its interest rate virtually to zero to stimulate a bubble. That's basically what happened recently. Nonetheless, the US economy continued to be mired in a crisis, and Europe, of course, never came out of it. The US would come out a little and then go back and so on. So, the upshot is that the tendency towards the ex-ante tendency to overproduction now is something which is not being checked by the formation of any bubbles. There is no state intervention in demand management. No nation state can intervene because finance doesn't like such state intervention. If any particular nation state intervened by enlarging the fiscal deficit, you would have financial outflow from there and therefore a crisis. If you had a global state that could then adopt Keynesian measures and tell finance that, look, we don't care. I mean, let's say a global social democratic state. Then finance could go to moon. And as a result, willingly, if you mobilize sufficient political pressure in order for such a state to adopt Keynesian demand management measures at a global level, by the way, Keynes had suggested this during the 1930s, a coordinated fiscal stimulus. Then you could, but we don't have a global scheme, no reason talking about it. So that is why we are going to have this crisis which is going to persist. Look at Trump's solution to the crisis. Trump's solution to the crisis is not for a coordinated fiscal stimulus. His solution is you maintain the free flow of finance, but in fact protect the economy, in other words, move out of the free flow of goods. Right? I mean, not completely move out, but prevent American capital from locating plants in China to export back to the US by having import tariffs. But on the other hand, financial flows are allowed. And to the extent American capital loses out, compensated by having enormous corporate tax cuts, which he has given. So the point is that the Marxist theory, I think, certainly to my mind, that version of Marxist theory, which talks about the tendency to overproduction because of the shift from wages to profit, is extremely relevant in present. Now there was a question about global, spheres of influence. Spheres of influence. Sure. I'm not saying that there is no capital originating in Germany. Obviously, it doesn't come stamped as global. But the point is that no amount of Indian state protecting the interests of the Adanis or the Ambanis would make that state protect the Ambanis and Adanis versus American capital versus German capital. Am I making myself clear? When we were talking in the interwar period, let us say, or even in the pre-First War which had started, we were actually talking about areas in which you prevented other capital from entering. Okay, if you talk about post-war Nehruvian regime, Indian capital had the market to itself because other capital was prevented from entering because of quantitative restrictions, because of tariffs and so on. If it set up an enterprise with Indian collaboration on Indian soil, then it benefited from those tariffs and so on because then it was also protected. But fundamentally, it could not produce there and send goods here because of the fact of tariffs and so on. So there is a difference between a nation state cordoning off a space for its own capital and a nation state promoting in various ways its capital but not being able to cordon off any space. When I was talking about sphere of influence, I was talking about cordoning off of such a space. Yes?
Sir, on that note, sir, I would like to kind of point out that in many cases when India is coercing its neighbor to refrain from joining the One Belt, One Road project, isn't it precisely trying to do that? Isn't it trying to use its sphere? Wouldn't Reliance have India use its?
But when it prevents its neighbor from joining the One Belt, One Road project, suppose I agree with you it is doing so in order to protect the interests of Indian capital. But it is not preventing in any way, it is simultaneously protecting the interests of every other capital as distinct from the Chinese. Am I making myself clear? So, I'll tell you this is an important issue because when neoliberalism started in 1991, let's not forget that for a very long time, throughout the Nehruvian period, by Nehruvian period I can write up to 1991 in the Gandhi, the Indian state had protected the Indian bourgeoisie against foreign capital. When neoliberalism started, in fact even before neoliberalism started, the development of Indian capitalism had actually run into a kind of portal. Foreign delegations would come, let's say Indo-US Joint Commission, Indo-German Business Council and so on, the negotiation would be that, look, allow us to export to Germany. To that they would say, okay, but you allow us to export to India. Okay, so there was that kind of thing. Then you had neoliberal policies where generally there was a reduction in protection and so on. Many of us have thought, I certainly have thought, that just as there was an opposition to neoliberalism from the left, there would also be an opposition to neoliberalism from the side of the capitalists. At least a segment of the capitalists. And we kept waiting. In fact, for a while it appeared, some Bombay Club and so on, for a while it appeared that some opposition from the capitalists the complicity of big capital in the neoliberal globalization project is such that they themselves would not lie to cordon off a space saying this is mine, because then someone else may cordon off some other space saying this is mine, in which case they may not be able to make inroads into Indonesia or Bangladesh or Europe, etc. So in that sense, the idea of cordoning off of spaces in the regime of neoliberalism under demands of various corporate financial oligarchies is something which is passé. All right. Then there was a question of delinking. What exactly do we mean by delinking? Okay, you see, what you find is that we are in a state that is a nation state. Okay, suppose tomorrow, let us say, the Maoists came to power in India. Let's just assume. We are in a world of nation states. The Maoists are not coming to power in the US or anywhere else. They come to power in India. Okay. Now they want to, let's say, spend more, on healthcare or education or whatever is the left agenda. The moment they do that, finance would leave, saying, look, leftists have come to power. In fact, finance would leave long before leftists have come anywhere into power, simply in the fear that they might come to power. Before Nelson Mandela came to power, there was huge capital outflow from South Africa. And as a result, to stem the capital outflow, Nelson Mandela's first finance minister was the same man who had been the finance minister under the apartheid regime. His name was delinking. Anyway, so the point is that we live in a world of nation states, but a world of globalized capital flows, particularly globalized financial flows. Therefore, if any intervention is going to be of a pro-people kind, if there will be any departure from neoliberalism, then the nation state must acquire some ability to do so. And that ability to do that necessarily requires that you cannot be caught in global financial flows. Okay. For that, capital controls are essential. Okay. So you are saying, what exactly would delinking mean? Capital controls would have to be necessarily imposed to prevent finance from flowing out. Otherwise, overnight you can suddenly become bankrupt. If you have controls on financial outflows, then your balance of payments would become difficult to finance. I mean, today, for instance, we have 3% trade deficit, current account deficit. How can you finance that? You will have to have some trade controls. Okay. So, by delinking, what I mean is, I don't like delinking necessarily. In fact, many people say that always talk about delinking in a world in which, mankind in some sense, after all, is now being thrown together to a much greater extent, which is a good thing. Okay. So why are you talking about delinking? Because unfortunately I'm an economist and I can see that, that in the absence of this, the state, you see, you cannot have, let's say you are not going to have a coordinated international workers' struggle that is going to set up a world state. You're not going to have a coordinated international peasant struggle to set up some world state, or an Asian state, or even a South Asian state. We still have states that are nation states. Any change in economic policy that can come about through political pressure can occur only at the level of the nation state. Therefore, the nation state must be liberated from being constrained by the fear of capital outflows, capital flight, and for that the amount of control that is required is what I call delinking. All right.
Thank you, Prabhat Patnaik. My name is Sahir Assam. Very simple question. In your various channels of narrowing the discussion of wages in recent times, you left out the movement of goods. I mean, of course, trade isn't free, but movement of goods between countries is one mechanism by which wages can become narrowed. And that has happened, I think, in our region. You can think of the garment industry in Bangladesh that has put up the women wages remarkably, and is filtered through in other sectors like domestic aid and so on. And the case of the software industry in India, like Bangalore, is another case in point. The wages growth there is significant vis-a-vis the rest of the economy. Thank you.
Yes, I agree with that. In fact, you can actually have situations where, let us say, wages were depressed to start with. If you have greater, activities shifting to that particular segment, in that case, wages might rise. But I had in mind something very different. I was talking about capital growth. But what I had in mind was that if you take the South as a whole, the North as a whole, in other words, you're certainly right that there can be pockets in which capital raise wages. In China, everybody says that in coastal China, the wages have been raised. Of course, they have been raised, but why they have been raised remains to be seen. But let's assume that there has been some tightness in the labor market, but not in the interior. But the point I'm trying to make, I was really comparing northern wages with southern wages. And if you look at the southern countries, where certainly it's true of India, it's true of other countries, the average real wage rate is something which has not gone up in this entire period, no matter how high the rate of growth of GDP, because the labor reserves continue. Okay. And similarly in the north, the real wage rate have not gone up, though they continue to be much higher than here. So that's what I was saying.
Prabhat Patnaik, this is Prabhat. I'm not a lawyer, but I actually followed your lecture very clearly. I have two very quick questions. First is, you talked about international finance, capital, imperialism. I was wondering if you have anything to say on what China is doing in Asia and Africa. With its strategic, military, political, economic might, there are many Chinese corporations which have invested heavily in Africa and Asia. And most of these corporations are owned by the Chinese state, which means they're controlled by the Communist Party. So would you call this Chinese imperialism or imperialism with Chinese characteristics? That's one. Second is, you talked about the argument that there has been a super exploitation in the past, and despite globalization, despite financial inflows from the north to the south, there continues to be super exploitation today. So my question is that if indeed there is super exploitation, why did the developing countries like India, who were historically following a different model of development, why did they give up that model of development and accepted a model of development which arguably was imposing that kind of exploitation? In case of India, the argument is it was the IMF bailout. Well, that bailout package elapsed after 2 years, but the reform process, slowly or fastly, whatever, has continued after that, and there has not been any shift in the economic policy, in that sense. So, if there is super exploitation, then it defies logic. Then why are you accepting a model which actually reinforces that so-called super exploitation?
Yeah, the reason why policies are pursued, one set of policies as opposed to another, is not because one set of policies is better than another set of policies, but because the beneficiaries of one set of policies are politically more powerful than the beneficiaries from the other set of policies. What has happened in India is that in the period in which, let's say, we pursued the neoliberal policies, which have brought us very high rates of growth and so on, let me just give you one statistic. If you look at the beginning of the 20th century, roughly around 1900, then you find that in what was then called British India, the per capita annual food grain availability was roughly around 200 kilograms per day. During the last 50 years of colonial rule, there was a drastic fall in per capita food grain availability. It fell to actually 138 in 1946-47, but let's assume that's an exceptional year. But roughly what you can say is that it was less than 150, so from 200 to 150 at the time of independence. After independence, with great deal of difficulty, the government of India really pushed up during the Nehruvian, what I call Nehruvian, goes right up to the neoliberal introduction. Per capita food grain availability roughly to about 180 kilograms in the Indian Union. 180 kilograms is still not as much as 200, but nonetheless represents an increase. In the period of neoliberalism, 1991 onwards, till now, you first had a plateau, then a fall, where now the the average per capita food grain availability in India is about 162 kilograms. It's roughly about the same as it was in the 1940s, in the period of war and so on. Now, you have very high rates of growth, and obviously per capita food grain availability is an indication of the extent of hunger among the people. Let's not forget India is one of the countries most afflicted by hunger at this moment. It is worse than Sub-Saharan Africa. It is worse than the average for what the United Nations call the least developed countries. Not the 40 countries, even call the least developed. So the point is that on precisely the, but by the way, I should clarify that when I say that people become better off when they, as they become better off, they consume more of these food grains. I don't mean directly food grains. I mean food grains directly and indirectly, which means, let's say, animal products. Food grains go as feed grains into animals. Many of your economies, in the Leontief sense, direct and indirect, processed food. In America, for instance, per capita annual food grain absorption is about 700 to 800 kilograms per year. Compared to in the former Soviet Union, it was 1 ton per year. Okay. In Europe, it's about 600 to 700 per year. So you actually find that as real incomes per capita increase, per capita food grain absorption, direct and indirect, increases. If it hasn't increased here, it's obviously not because people have somehow decided to change their habits and tastes and so on, but because of the fact that purchasing power in their hands is something which has not been adequate in order to sustain the kind of food grain intake they would like to have. So the fact that there was a change in policy is not because this policy was in some sense better for everybody, but this policy was better for some. It is very good, not just for the Ambanis and Adanis, let me very frank, very good for the particular, it's good for me. It's good for vast sections of the Indian middle class, which at the moment, however, may be beginning to feel the pinch because now the crisis is catching up with us. So the point is that a very articulate segment can really demand a change in policy, and that change comes about because this articulate segment is politically powerful, even though the counterpart of that could be a worsening in the lot of parts of people. Okay? So policy changes are not necessarily always in the direction which reason would dictate. All right. Your other question was about China. That's very interesting. Okay, I think I should clarify some things. The fact that US multinationals invest in third world countries, China, Vietnam, India, and so on, is per se not what I would call imperialism. In other words, many people believe that imperialism consists only in that, but I have a different view of this, which I have not talked about today. But since you're asking me to, I just very briefly mention. I see a continuation between the colonial period and now. By the way, what I'm going to say is written as a book called The Theory of Imperialism, which Utsa and I, Utsa is my wife, who have joined me. So anyway, so what we argue is the following, that with capital accumulation, the demand for all kinds of goods increases, including the demands for a whole range of goods whose supplies do not necessarily increase because they are produced by a limited landmass, particularly by a limited tropical landmass. Now, that being the case, with capital accumulation, it becomes necessary to prevent a rise in their prices by imposing income deflation, income squeeze on large numbers of people located on that landmass so that you can have supplies coming out to satisfy the demands in the advanced countries. Now, colonialism did that through a taxation system. Okay, colonial taxation system is that. But on the other hand, in today's world, that is done through all these measures of income compression, through austerity measures, through fiscal deficits being compressed, through reduction in government expenditure in rural areas and all the rest. Okay. Now, I think neoliberalism, therefore, squeezes the demand for a whole range of goods, and this is something that releases those goods without causing inflationary pressures in the world but anyway, so the upshot is that I think of that. Now, if the Chinese, I mean, a question often arises. Now we have got this bank, let us say, which is, created with Chinese capital and so on. If that bank insisted upon, I mean, let's say that China gives a loan to an African country, let us say. Now they're saying without any conditionalities. If that bank insists that the country which has taken the loan must deflate its economy in order to be able to pay back the loan, which is what Greece is being asked to do, then I would say, yes, the Chinese are mimicking exactly what Western imperialism is. Am I making myself clear? Yeah. If the okay, in a word, if the Chinese did to Africa what Eurozone is doing to Greece, I would say that yes. But I mean, they may well do it, but let's, for the time being, I would like to reserve judgment. Any other questions? No? All right.
This very provocative and a very engaging discussion. I'm sure we're all going back feeling much more enriched and with many more questions that we would like to think about in order to, which will help us understand the world we live better. Thank you, sir.
Thank you everyone for being a part of this. I would like to invite you all to tea outside and hopefully our discussions will also continue.